Hi, I'm Rochelle, and you're listening to Box F1 Pod. Today we're debriefing the Hungarian Grand Prix, which, as far as Grand Prix go, was pretty all over the place. By the way, if you want to play a fun drinking game, I'm pretty sure I said Ferrari needs to get their shit together at least 20 times, so keep an eye out for that. But before we dive into reviewing the race, it's time for the digital warm-up. Do-do-do! Lap 1, outfit of the day. All right, going for a very speedy outfit of the day today. I'm going to focus on the ones I hated the most, really. First up, Guanyu in head-to-toe white Prada, including the bucket hat. And a bucket hat is like the accessory to have around the paddock these days. In fact, I hear Valtteri's coming out with his own line of bucket hats, but that's neither here nor there. That's neither here nor there. Guanyu stepped out in a head-to-toe white Prada outfit, including the bucket hat, and he looked great, as he always does. He was also on the cover of a Chinese magazine where he posed in a collection of outfits and looked incredible in every single one of them. So, killing it as per. Next up, I'm just going to quickly go through the good Lewis outfits. He wore an Isamayaki orange zip-up and pants. It's that pleated designer that we've seen him wear before. It looked good. It looked fine. And his second outfit was an AGR knit sweater, which was like an reddish, orange, purplish ombre sweater and gray track pants. Also fine. He looked good. It was a fine outfit. And it wasn't that warm there, so a sweater is probably appropriate. And then he wore a Lacoste mint green mustard tracksuit, which honestly made him look like he was an extra on Stranger Things. And finally, this one kills me. Finally, he wore an outfit that was straight up from the Moncler and J.W. Anderson collab. Okay, so it was like a yellow mustard pants, a white oversized t-shirt with like a green dots that were acid wash on the shirt, and a bright yellow knitted bucket hat with bright blue dots on it. Honestly, it looked like the color palette was inspired by an episode of Blue's Clues. Like, on one hand, can't fault Lewis too much because he straight up took it off the runway, this entire outfit from head to toe. But also you can kind of fault him because there were so many other outfits to choose from. It's an absurd outfit, any way you look at it. So that's at the bottom of my list this week, but close second is from Charles, actually, who showed up head to toe in a designer called Namis, I don't know how to pronounce it. Top was like a basic graphic tee, but my issue lies with his bottoms, which were cable knit white cashmere basketball shorts, which I can see possibly working as loungewear, but to wear like outdoors, like what is the function of these shorts? Like, what do you do in them? Like, what weather are they meant for? What is their purpose? I'm truly baffled by these cashmere cable knit shorts. It looks like a hot water bottle cover that it just shouldn't be in shorts form. Anyway, so as per usual, Guanyu wins for me personally, but Lewis lost in a major way. and with one outfit. All right, lap 2, Fernando's birthday. Fernando turned 41, as Otmar put it. Happy birthday, 41, for the number 14. Amazing. Awkward as always. He got a tiramisu cake, which they posted on Instagram, and he's grinning with a thumbs up. It's like a very basic cake, but I will give props to this cake because a tiramisu is like a very specific cake to make for someone, so it's clearly a fave of his. So if they made him his favorite cake, then that wins over any fancy cake that they've made other people that make no sense. Also, the people that wished Fernando a happy birthday include Esteban, Guanyu, Carlos, and Carlos Sr. I'm glad to see the Spanish drivers are all sticking close together. Another great Fernando moment was Alpine posted a video of Esteban and Fernando playing rock, paper, scissors, but for the first half of that video, Esteban has to teach Fernando how to play rock, paper, scissors because he's never played. Um, don't know how you're 41 and have never played a game of rock, paper, scissors, but Fernando won and like finished the game with like the shrug, like, duh, like, why wouldn't I win? But it was quite amusing to watch Esteban attempt to explain rock, paper, scissors to him and being just confused how he has to do that. Lap 3, Sebastian Vettel. So, despite telling us literally a week ago that he is not planning on going anywhere, he's sticking around for a while. On Thursday, Seb announced that he's retiring from F1 via a brand new Instagram page because he wasn't on Instagram before. So he created an Instagram page and posted these 2 videos, black and white, several minutes long. It's the same video, just one's in German and one's in English, where he announces his retirement, talks about what the sport means to him, and how he is excited for what's to come, which is heartbreaking. And the amount of tributes that flooded social media was wild. It just reminded me of when Kimmy retired. Lando said in an interview, he was asked what it means to him, and he's like, I've never spoken to Kimmy. The same can clearly not be said for Seb. Even like Guanyu, who has literally been here for half a minute, was able to post a tribute and say something about him, clearly having interacted with him. Everyone has incredible stories about him. There was a bunch of TikTok videos created to like sad music about all his times and about like what's to come and how much we love him. And a box messaged me being like, I get it's a big deal that he's retiring, but he's not dying. And it truly feels like he's just straight up dead based on some of these tributes. And I cried more than once. Some of these really pulled at the old heartstrings. But there's just part of me wants to go through every single tribute, wants to go through every single Seb moment, but like it's just not enough justice can be done in a 2-minute segment. So I've decided that I'm going to dedicate a mini episode to Seb to chat about his career, some of the best dedications and tributes that I've seen of him online, and also to review some of our favorite subtle Seb moments, subtle activism to his subtle jokes to his like subtle icon status. Subtle Seb for sure deserves an entire episode. For now, I'll just say this is a very bittersweet moment. I'm so happy I got this little time with Seb, and I can't wait to review all his best moments, all his best jokes, all his best everything in the Subtle Seb episode to come. Anyway, that concludes our digital warm-up. Now on to the race rhyme. Welcome to the Hungarian Grand Prix, where it might rain, it's an F1 guarantee. In quali, both Red Bull engines fail, which is unlucky, and George gets his first pole ever. Way to go, buddy! On race day, it's lights out and away we go. Will it rain? We'll know in a few laps or so. Lap 1, Alex and Lance cause a virtual safety car. On that restart, though, George is a shining star. He leads the race for a while and defends against Charles with style. But Charles is the fastest man on track. Ain't no one getting in the way of his attack. But when Charles does well, guess who comes along? It's Mattia and his crew, ready to get strategy all wrong. Naturally, off go the good mediums and in comes the hard tire. Ferrari loves turning a fiery performance into a dumpster fire. Elsewhere in the midfield, the Alpines battle, and for a moment, Danny overtakes both like he's herding cattle. Otherwise, the best thing today is Max Verstappen. He goes from P10 to P1 despite that spin that happened. At the end, Lewis overtakes George into P2 like a pro. Shout out D2 Valtteri's smooth assist, DNFing with 1 lap to go. As our top 3 pass the checkered flag, it finally starts to rain. We told you it was only a couple laps away, now pop the champagne. Well, that's a wrap on the Hungarian GP. Time for a quick break before Spa. Yippee! Woohoo! Alright, on to analysis. So, free practice on Saturday was pretty wet, but the rain stopped in time for qualifying. The biggest thing that happened really was that Max seemed to have lost power completely in Q3, so he ended up in P10 despite making it all the way to Q3. And the other big moment was that Ferrari was set to be top 2 with Carlos on pole, and then literally the clock goes to 0, people are just finishing up their laps, everyone was already talking like Carlos got a second pole, that it was all done, and then George takes pole at like the last second, and it was so cool. And the best moment was his engineer went on the radio and was like, "You made it!" And George was like, "Woo!" So really happy for him. The rest of the results are George P1, Carlos P2, Charles P3, Lando P4, Esteban P5, Fernando P6, Lewis P7, Valtteri P8, Daniel P9, and Max P10. The following day, though, race day, Pierre actually got an engine change, and since he has already exceeded the legal amount of changes, he had to start from the pit lane. Both Max and Checo also got engine changes, but since they have not yet exceeded the quota for the year, they didn't have to start at the back of the grid. They instead got to start where they qualified. So Max was in P10 and Checo was in P11. Okay, so this race was kind of weird. My friend described it as random, and I feel like that's the best word to encapsulate the day. It was kind of all over the place, so going through it chronologically doesn't really make sense. Instead, I'm gonna discuss the race by focusing on important race moments and the overall performance for the top teams as well as the midfield. So first, I think I'm gonna cover the big incidents that happened during the race. There weren't many, but the first one was in lap 1 when Alex Albon and Lance Stroll had contact, and there was debris everywhere. Alex was literally dragging a chunk of the car along with him on the ground. So the virtual safety car came out, but that only lasted like 2 laps. And then around lap 6, Kevin got a black and orange flag because half of his car was hanging off. So he had to pit, but it didn't really stop race time. And the very final yellow flag was at the very end of the race, like lap 68. Valtteri had to retire. He pulled over to the side of the road, so it was a very brief virtual safety car, but it basically solidified the end of the race. There was nothing to do about it because once it picked up, there was one lap left. But also important to note, there were like 3 spins. So the track was definitely damp from something. It didn't rain until like the last lap of the race. And the last time it had rained was like the previous morning. So whether it was left over from the day before or if it was imaginary water, people were spinning left and right. So something was odd about the track for sure. So pit and tire strategy were pretty important during this race. We went into the race anticipating rain. We did get rain during the last lap, but obviously that didn't affect the rest of the race, though it didn't stop every single engineer the entire race going, oh, 2 more laps. Oh, there it comes. You know, it's right around the corner. And then it wasn't around the corner. So it's like their favorite thing to do. But it did feel like it was getting damper because, as we said, people were spinning and the drivers are actually complaining about it on the radio. But despite the fact that it hadn't rained, there was still significantly cooler conditions. So that kind of almost made the tire strategy seem relatively straightforward. Hard tires were the least favorable options. And even though some teams did experiment with it, it didn't really lead to anything great. Maybe it would give them like a neutral result, but overall, nothing good happened from the hard tires. It was clearly not the best tire to choose, and the best options were medium and the soft. And at that point, it just became about finding the right pit strategy so that you could make the most out of the medium and the soft tires. And the ideal situation would have been a 2-stop strategy, obviously, with the medium and then switching to the soft. But that didn't really work out for many teams. People had random strategies. Alpine went for a 1-stop strategy with the second stint of the race being on hards, but it was the bulk of the race. They pitted like lap 20-ish, and then went the rest of it on hards, which was okay. They didn't really have the best results from that. They didn't beat McLaren. But I believe Red Bull had a 3-stop strategy, and so there was some differentiation, but one thing that seemed to be like a hard agree is that hard tires were not the way to go unless you're Ferrari. And we'll get to dissecting Ferrari in a second, but needless to say, their strategy game was like not on point today, nor was their pit stop game. In fact, speaking of pit stops, they were kind of all over the place. They were either really, really slow, like late 3s over into 4s, or some teams banged out stops under 3 seconds. McLaren had like a 2.41, I think. Red Bull obviously had a good one, and even Ferrari had one good one. But overall, it was there was no like average ones. They were either really good or kind of bad. All right, let's talk about the midfield. So at this point, the midfield battle is basically just McLaren and Alpine. The top 5 passed through the midfield quite often today, actually, especially since Red Bull started in 10th and 11th, and Ferrari kept falling behind at various points. But to be honest, the focus here in the midfield was really just McLaren and Alpine and their races with each other. So let's start with Alpine. Just a quick throwback to Hungary 2021. It was Esteban's first race win, and it also gave us the iconic photo of Fernando lifting him up in a hug in celebration. Very cute moment, very wholesome. But it seems a year on, they are displaying far less camaraderie, at least on the track. First up, at the very beginning of this race, Fernando literally goes on the radio and says, "Never in my life I saw a defense like Esteban." Clearly, Esteban is not defending like a lion. But in Fernando's defense, Esteban was kind of all over the tracks. And overall, throughout the race, both Fernando and Esteban pulled out the Alpine specialty, a train. And sometimes it was like an entire team. So it would be like Alpine on either end, and then a Red Bull sandwich in the middle, or a McLaren. Someone was always somehow stuck behind an Alpine. And the reason I think also it seemed like Alpine was always in the mix of it is because they somehow were like the gatekeepers to the pit lane exit. So it felt like every time someone exited the pit lane and back on track, Alpine was just there. It was just like Alpine territory. So every time they'd have to overtake or came out right ahead. And so they were mentioned every single time. But to be honest, despite the fact that they were always in the mix of it, it seemed like Fernando and Esteban were kind of distracted by each other and they weren't really paying much attention to anyone else. It's been a trend with them for like a couple of weeks, but it became kind of very obvious today when after Esteban's pit stop around lap 24, which was 4.6 seconds, by the way, he came out right next to Fernando and Daniel, and Esteban and Fernando almost seemed kind of distracted by each other to the point where Daniel literally overtook them both in one fell swoop, which was a great move by Daniel. But yeah, Fernando and Esteban are being kind of weird. Like, they're still competitors, especially within the midfield. Like, they're still a good competition, and they're certainly McLaren's biggest competitor, but they're acting kind of weird. Speaking of McLaren, though, this one's kind of tough to talk about. They're kind of like a nothing burger this year. They're there and they're hustling in the midfield, but it's like little to write home about. They can't really explain it, and they can't really get the car to where it needs to be. And any successes that they've had, like Lando's podium, almost seems like an accident. I guess that's not really fair. It's probably luck and driver skill, but they don't really have the car to back up those successes, is kind of what I mean. Anyway, like I said, their main rivalry has been with Alpine this year, who unfortunately have a much, much stronger car. So it really does seem to come down to luck and skill. First, let's talk about Daniel. He actually qualified ninth, which is really great for him, and he was doing relatively well during the race. Of course, there was that moment with Alpine when he overtook both cars in one go. And before I continue, I just really need to call this out. It was really annoying when he did that. The commentators went, "Welcome back, Daniel." Like, can we calm down on the Daniel front? Like, he's here. Yeah, he's been struggling, but it's not like a shock when he does a great move because he is a great driver and we all know that. It's not like he does one good overtake and it's like, "Oh, we have to say he's back." He hasn't gone anywhere, and it's also not indicative that he's suddenly going to like win every race. Like, let's just leave Daniel alone. He's a good driver that can't seem to follow through, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't have good moments throughout the race. It just kind of peeved me when they said that. Anyway, besides that great moment, luck was again not really on Daniel's side. In the second half of the race, around lap 47, Lance tried to overtake Daniel and they touched, and Lance spun. So we've been asking for it all year and they've pretty much delivered, but the race directors have been very consistent with their rulings this year, and they found Daniel to have caused the spin, which is consistent with their previous rulings in other races. And of course, that landed Daniel a 5-second penalty, which is classic Stu. And this obviously set him back, and he ended up finishing the race in 15th. Needless to say, post-race, Daniel said that he's more than relieved to be heading into the summer break. And we did, to be fair, see what the break did for Daniel and his performance last year. He came back and like devoured Monza. So we can only send positive vibes his way and hope it's a repeat of last year. this year. So let's talk about Lando now. He had a slightly better day than Daniel, which, to be honest, wasn't the hardest. He started his race in P4, which was really good for him. And it also sent the British pundits into a tizzy because there were 3 British drivers in the top 5. Oh my god. But that was short-lived because like lap 11-ish, Lando was already in an intense battle for P4 with Hamilton and Max, who had at this point worked his way up from P10. Hamilton overtook Lando and was immediately followed by Max. The commentators described that in-between situation quite colorfully by saying, Lando's driving as he saw Verstappen menacingly in his mirrors. Verstappen's always menacing for them. Anyone can be in your rearview mirrors, but Verstappen is menacing. But it also got them like super excited about how this generation's car allows drivers to follow far closer than ever before. A few weeks ago when Dias was on for Silverstone, he made a bold claim that this was actually just an aggressive marketing push from F1 to make it seem like the new upgrades were actually really good for overtaking this year than in years past, but it's not necessarily the case. So I really need someone to do like a comparative analysis of last year and this year to see which one had more overtakes. But I will say it does feel like we're getting a lot more side-by-side action this year than we have in previous years. Anyway, the rest of Lando's race was pretty like humdrum. His main concern was staying ahead of the Alpines, which he successfully did. He finished in P7 ahead of both Esteban and Fernando, and his post-race reaction was like shrug, because like what can he actually say? He doesn't suck like he did at the beginning of the season, but he's also not like storming the castle, you know? So like all you can do is like, yeah, I'm fine. He was like, I'm a holiday, and then I'm gonna work during the summer break. So it was just like he's not disappointed, but he's also not whooping with joy. And that kind of summarizes McLaren this year. All right, let's go on to Ferrari. Not much I can say ahead of this. Just gonna dive in because let's start with Carlos. Lucky for him, he escaped the full wrath of terrible decisions made by Ferrari today, but he did fall victim to a shitty Ferrari pit stop, which from Mattia's POV is the best pit stop ever done. But this very lengthy pit stop did more or less cost Carlos a podium position. So he did start in P2, and he put up a great challenge to George, though eventually Ferrari ended up making a pretty good pit stop call for Charles, which actually landed Carlos behind his own teammate. He was basically called in for a pit at one point, but it turned out to be a fake out. At first, it felt like he was completely ignoring them, and then we realized that Ferrari was, I guess, trying to trick Mercedes, and they fell for it. So George came in, although, to be fair, there is the possibility that Mercedes was already planning to do a pit stop, but it kind of seemed like they just fell for Ferrari's thing. So George came in, and then Carlos followed immediately to attempt an overcut. But after that, it kind of seemed like Carlos spent half his time battling for P2, but unfortunately, around lap 46, he had a 4.2 pit stop, which sort of halted any chance for him to podium, and he ended up finishing P4. So he got so close, but not quite there. So overall, not a bad day for Carlos, but it's also not that great a day for him either. So compared to Charles, Carlos had an epic day. Charles actually starts out with a pretty good race. His first pit stop goes amazing. He's setting fastest laps. He is the man on track. His first epic moment is in battle with George, which goes on for several minutes, and George actually puts up a really good fight. So good, in fact, that the commentators really felt the need to say that George is being feisty, but it might not be total heartbreak for Charles Leclerc. And I would personally like to request for us to go at least one race without the word heartbreak and Charles being used in one sentence, because they 100% jinxed him. What followed was not quite as big a heartbreak as in races past, but it certainly was up there in terms of disappointments. So Charles was basically leading the race at this point. He was really pumping out fast lap after fast lap. Everything was going great. And in full honesty, I went to the bathroom and then I came back and shit had hit the fan and I had no idea what was going on, so I had to rewind. And in the space it took me to pee, um, Ferrari had decided to call Charles in for a pit stop out of the blue, completely random. He kept trying to repeat on the radio that his tires feel fine. And it certainly looked that way to us and to the commentators and to perhaps everyone besides Ferrari, who didn't seem to notice that he was the fastest human there. But Ferrari called him in anyway and put him on hard tires. And we talked about this during our tire and pits stop strategy debrief, but hards are a no-go. There was just a hard no on hards. It'd been tested by other teams. We saw not great results, usually poor results. And basically later on Christian was asked about it and he was like, well, I looked up and I could see this was not the day for hards. Mattia clearly didn't look up. No one there looked up because Charles on they put Charles on hards, and some of the great reactions were the commentator saying, well, that's brave. And then a couple laps later, have Ferrari made a bit of a blunder? And then Charles gets on the radio and goes, these tires are shit. They were shit. He had zero grip. He couldn't do anything. He went from fastest man on track to being passed over and over and over again. Made zero sense. Pretty tragic. The funniest reaction to all of this, though, was Matthias straight up leaving the pit wall, like, peace, I'm out of here. He did return, like, several laps later. I don't know if he, like, took the moment to scream into a black void, or he took a shot of grappa, did something to, recover, because he clearly needed a moment. This was a lot for him. Anyway, lap 54, Charles was boxed again, and he managed to finish 6th, but it's just kind of depressing. After the race, Toto actually came to the defense of Ferrari and said that they didn't really make a mistake today. They actually made the mistake earlier this weekend because they did not have a set of new mediums to put Charles on, and it was too early for softs, and so they had no choice but to put him on hards, which would be a valid defense if Charles needed to pit. He shouldn't have been called into pit at all. He was still fine on his tires. So really the mistake was calling him into pit. And then once he had come into the pit lane, they had no choice but to put whatever tires they had. But he shouldn't have been called in at all. After the race, Charles was asked, could you please explain the strategy that you guys used today? And Charles just went, not yet. And then he went on a little bit of a not tirade, but he was like, it's kind of sad because I had a great first half, but no one's going to remember the first half because they'll just remember what a disaster my second half of the race was, which is true. I remember how amazing his first half was, but it's certainly overshadowed by how tragic his second half was. And then this is the same interviewer that basically asked Charles if he was in therapy. This interviewer needs to, like, pull back on the intrusive questions. But she was like, so tell me exactly what you're going to talk about with your team later. What exactly will you say to them? And Charles was like, we'll talk about it. And then basically walked away. But in the middle of that interview, George did interrupt Charles, gave him a quick hug, and just went unlucky, which is one way to put it. Another way to put it is that Ferrari needs to get their shit together. Carlos was also asked about what he thinks of external criticism about the Ferrari strategy, and he basically thinks it's wrong. He said, like, for example, today, when you're struggling with race pace, strategy doesn't really matter. He's like, I did have a slow pit stop. I don't know if you want to count a slow pit stop as strategy. On one hand, it sounds like Carlos is being super corporate. Like, that was a George response almost. But on the other hand, that was basically Carlos's race today. And I kind of feel like he probably wasn't up to speed on what happened to Charles yet. And he probably really should focus on his own race. And if he wasn't fucked in this particular race, he shouldn't upset Ferrari, I suppose. But really, I feel like he just didn't know yet what happened. And the only thing that messed him up was the slow pit stop. So that's what he commented on. Overall, Ferrari continues to be a joke. And we can only hope and pray that the summer break will give them some new perspective and they'll come back and have the best strategy on the grid. But it might be too little too late. And also, better not to get our hopes up because we know what Ferrari's like. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, still shame on you. Ferrari, get your shit together. All right, let's move on to Mercedes. So Mercedes had a pretty mediocre Friday and Saturday, certainly a crappy Friday. Wasn't a great qualifying for Lewis, but they pulled through during the race, and it seems like they can't necessarily explain what's happening, slash they want to stick with the narrative, like they can't exactly explain what's happening. But they are competing at the front, and they seem to be consistently doing that. So something's going right, whether they know what it is, whether they don't know what it is, or whether they're pretending not to know what it is, even though they do know what it is. So let's start with George. First of all, he had the first Mercedes pole of the year. He also had his first pole ever, so that's pretty great for him and Mercedes. It was really cute to see him up there. And it was really sweet to hear the radio message with his engineer, who seemed just as excited as he was. Sunday, he got a pretty decent start. Carlos did give him a run for his money, and it did seem like George was starting to struggle a bit to keep on the racing line. But what did save George was the virtual safety car in lap 1. So he really wasn't struggling for that long. But we saw last week how quick he is on the restart, and this week was no different. Checo tried to blame it on his software or whatever, the virtual safety car dingling in his car that lets him know that it's over. Was Carlos having the same issue? Because George zoomed off, got a pretty good head start over Carlos as soon as the green flag hit the track. And he could build up quite a good distance between him and Carlos. His big battle with Charles, which we talked about a little earlier. But I really want to talk about it from George's perspective, because dude does a great defense. It took nearly 4 laps of attempted overtakes by Charles, who was in a faster car, to make it stick. And the way that George was able to anticipate moves and blocked Charles over and over again was really impressive. He also had another good battle for P2 with Carlos, but really his next big moment was after Charles' second pit stop. He was closing in on Charles menacingly. Like, they didn't use the word menacingly, but I'm going to use it on George. It's not just Max who can be menacing. But really, Charles just couldn't handle it this time, and George was able to overtake quite easily. Like, Charles could do nothing. His tires were useless. But despite looking like today might be the day for him to win his first race, it really wasn't meant to be for George. He managed to hold on to P2 for quite a bit, almost till the very end. But Lewis was closing in on him for a while, and George did defend quite well. I'm sure Alonso would describe it as defending like a lion. But in lap 65, Lewis overtook him into second place, and it didn't seem like it was on team orders. So George finished in third again, which is still really great despite what the day promised. And he didn't actually seem too down about it, which is also good that his attitude is confident moving forward. Could have been putting on a brave front. I'm sure he was disappointed, but he was still smiling, and he still got another podium finish. And of course, he has finished top 5 in every single race that he has finished. So George is just on the up and up. All right, let's talk about Lewis a bit. He had a pretty bad qualifying. He started the race in P7, but he actually had a very good race. He fought his way up to P3, and obviously that fluctuated given pit stops and having slow pit stops himself. But Charles's tire situation really allowed him to get ahead and fight for podium position. His greatest moment today was probably his battle with George when he finally overtook him by trying to go round the outside and then switching back to the inside. The old switcheroo, as the pundits like to call it. Unfortunately, this move seems to keep happening to George. He's really good at defending, until it's been several laps, and then suddenly someone pulls the old switcheroo on him. So hopefully George learns from that, but it was cool to see them battling. Also, I did like that almost right after Lewis overtook George, Valtteri just happened to DNF, which basically caused the virtual safety car to come out and stay basically until the last lap of the race, which conveniently left no time for anyone to overtake Lewis. So Valtteri may have switched teams, but he continues to be a very unnecessarily loyal D2. Always there for Lewis. Also, just need to shout out Lewis's post-race interview, which always delivers. He said, "Just want to say thank you to our team for working so hard. Great way to go into the break, knowing we could challenge the guys up front when we get back. Lewis, you're challenging them now. You're challenging them now. You're not like, it's not like a surprise. You've been challenging them for weeks." And then he ends with, "Enjoy the summer, guys." And then he got asked what he's going to be doing this summer break, and he said, "Oh yes, of course, I will be training." Also want to shout out Toto's post-race interview where he said, where he talked about how he felt on Friday, and he was like, "Every year we sort of prepared for the concept of losing, but it's not quite the same as actually losing, because losing sucks. There was a moment on Friday when I wasn't the best me." And then he went on a rant about studies that have been done on the difference between exuberance and depression, which is the most Toto thing to ever happen. But yeah. Mercedes is on the up and up whether they want to admit that it was self-engineered or not. They, for some reason, want to keep pretending it's an accident. But Mercedes is definitely putting pressure on Ferrari for keeping the Constructors' Championship in the next half of the season for sure. All right, let's talk about Red Bull. Red Bull had quite a few issues during quali. Both cars suffered with engine issues, which put them in P10 Max and P11 Checo. Both cars ended up getting an engine change, but since they haven't met the limit for the year yet, they were both able to start the race where they qualified. Checo, that was P11, and his race was a bit less interesting than Max. Yes, it continued to be a difficult race for him, which is a bit hard to watch considering what a strong season start he had, but he still managed to finish P5, which is relatively close to the podium, and he was always in the mix of it, so he's not like discounted at all, but I hope that the break gives him some time to rest and to come back as strong as he was when the season first started. Also, side note, Checo was always in the mix during the race, as I said, but this seemed to like really translate to post-race because in the media pen, the interviews that F1 was doing, it seemed like Checo was always in the background. He was lurking behind, sipping on his water. I don't know if people kept cutting in front of him or if he was just trying to listen in or just didn't know where to go, but he was straight up behind every person, just gymming the camera. As in Jim from The Office. Is gymming a word? Anyway, it was amusing. Okay, so let's talk about Max a little bit. So he had a bit of a more exciting race than Checo. He started in P10, and in like 10 laps, he had made his way up to the top 4. Also, Charles's tire situation really gave Max an easy pass forward as well. He overtook Charles around lap 45-ish, and literally almost as soon as he passed Charles, and everyone was going, "Woohoo, Max!" and everyone was going, "Oh man, Charles." Max spun. Like, he did a full 360 and then just kept driving. It had zero effect on his race. And so by lap 51, Max was in first, and he kept it. He was clearly the fastest car on track at this point. He was also the most consistent on track, and he was able to finish the race in first. His engineer, I talked about this a bit last week, about how his engineer seems to have been trained to only say understood to everything. Like earlier in the race, Max went, "I think it might be drizzling," and his engineer went, understood. Max just wants to like have a bit of a chat as he coasts through these races, but it sounds like his engineer might be scarred from radio conversations of the past, so he's sticking to understood. But he did show a bit of emotion for Max winning. He got sort of like a well done from his engineer. Max can basically always count on a good chat with Christian. They had like a full-blown conversation that ended with Christian going, "It's a great way to head into summer, although it doesn't feel like summer." And Max goes, "Could use some sun." Haha. So I'm really glad Max was able to get his weather chat in. He's been trying to do that for the entire race. Later on in post-race interviews, Christian actually went so far as to say that he thinks this is Max's best race yet. It's honestly becoming quite difficult to label Max's best races because he literally just flies ahead with no mistakes. Like, he's so good. It's almost boring, which is a good thing. I don't want him like landing on top of people's cars or anything, but like he's just very, very good every single time. Because it's like it's not just about being a really good driver, it's also about having the consistency. That's what always made Lewis so great, and it seems like Max is heading in that direction as well. So it's great to see him maturing his driving style and abilities and honing that skill set into just being consistently so good. All right, so a little on post-race. Lewis did actually stay in the cool-down room this time around. He and Max had a full conversation before George even arrived. And same with the podium. They mostly sprayed their own teams, but towards the end they started spraying each other. And honestly, I can't help but like read into these interactions, and I think we can read into them when it comes to most drivers actually, but when it comes to Max and Lewis in particular, there's just like no point. I saw an Instagram post of the two of them on the podium next to each other with the caption, "Nature is healing." But like, was there even anything to heal between them? Max didn't make the call at the end of Abu Dhabi. He just benefited from it and reveled in the win like anyone else would. Um, Max and Lewis's relationship hasn't really changed. They've always kind of been civil and respectful, off track for sure. Things got a bit fuzzy last year, but that was sort of a consequence of their environment more so than them. Um, they're not friends, and they don't have to be friends. Standing next to each other on the podium doesn't demonstrate anything one way or the other. Anyways, for me, the best part of the cool down room today was when they were watching the replays and Charles was on, and I think it was Lewis who shouted out, "He went on the hard," as they showed Charles's pit stop, and the other two gave this side eye nod like, right? Because no one can believe it. All right, let's quickly go through the results. All right, so Max first, Lewis with the fastest lap in P2, then George, Carlos, Checo, Charles, Lando, Alonso, Esteban, and Seb in P10. Lance is in P11, so Seb managed to finish the job from the French Grand Prix. For those that don't remember, Seb attempted an overtake within like sight of the checkered flag over Lance into P10, and he failed. This race he managed. The driver of the day officially is Max. You can't really argue with that. He was phenomenal. But unofficially, I'd like to shout out George, who got pole for the first time, and he had some pretty epic battles today. Like, he is the king of defense, in my opinion. Oh, well, he's close to the Minister of Defense. He's under Minister of Defense. First comes Checo, George's training. All right, Dick in the box. Yeah, it's still Ferrari. If Ferrari's goal is to be the butt of the joke every single week, then their strategy is fantastic. If their goal is to turn Charles into a walking Lana Del Rey song, then they're succeeding. But if their goal is to actually be the best, not just say it, but actually be the best, then they're failing harder than the hard tires they forced onto poor Charles today. Disaster. Get your shit together, Ferrari. All right, the standings. First is Max with 258 points, followed by Charles with 178 points, followed by Checo with 173 points, so he is only 5 points away from being second. Then is George with 158, Carlos with 156, Lewis with 146, Lando with 76, and it's just all under 100 from there. The constructor standings are currently Red Bull with 431, Ferrari with 334, Mercedes with 304, Alpine with 99, McLaren with 95, and so on and so forth. Alpine and McLaren for sure can battle it out for fourth. P3 in the constructors is going to go to either Ferrari or Mercedes. At the rate that Mercedes is going, they will likely take second. I don't think anyone is catching up to Red Bull at this point. But if Ferrari gets their shit together, perhaps. But I do think that Mercedes has a very high chance of making it to P2 unless Ferrari gets their shit together. That's it for the Hungarian Grand Prix. We're headed into the summer break now. As promised, I'm going to work on getting some guests lined up for when we return. Otherwise, I'm going to do a couple mini episodes during the break. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I'll probably do a Seb episode. I might do a movie review. If you've got a request for a summer break episode or a suggestion for a potential guest, email me, DM me. In the meantime, make sure you follow me on social media and subscribe to the podcast so you know when the next episode comes out. You can reach out to me on any platform. It's all BoxBox F1 Pod. And yeah, I can't wait to hear from you. I've had a wonderful first half of the season, and I can't wait to see you guys after the summer break. See you soon. BoxBox.